We're going to be referencing, how to be original. I mean, it's such a ridiculously nebulous topic. It's completely relative to the writer, but I'm going to go into more than just that. It's, how to dig into your project from a pretty literal sense and looking at what you have. Is it, high concept? Is it low concept? What's the difference between that? Plot versus so-called non-plot, which really there isn't such a thing. And some character and story elements that need to be involved. But overall, the whole point here is to remind everybody that, kind of in reference to what I was saying as far as educating ourselves, we have to know what's come before us. We have to be a student of the craft, whether it's literally of the writing and screenwriting craft or just of the industry in general. We have to know that if this project that I'm working on, and I'm going to spend the next 6 to 12 months working on it, if this has similarities to other project, it's fine. It's not the end of the world, but what can I do to enhance it a little bit? And we have to dig in and really ask questions, like, why am I the one to write this? What do I have to say? All of that stuff. Let's get started. I kind of want to talk about this idea of comparison, because when I'm working with my writers, or even just when we have events like this, we get a lot of questions about, or at least I should say comments about how, this writer or this filmmaker did it this way, or they wrote the script in this format, or they have this style, et cetera, et cetera. So I should do it that way. And on one hand, okay, like, sure, you can try to follow someone's style, but that's their style. It's this idea of, if you see a Monet or a painting by Monet and you're like, well, gosh, he's so good, everybody loves him, I have to paint like him. It's kind of ridiculous if you think about that. It's a different medium and art form, of course, but you are you. So a lot of what I want to go into here is considering why am I the one to be writing my screenplay? What do I have to say, and how do I want to say it? So there's nothing wrong with looking at material, reading a ton of scripts, which we all should be doing, and using them for educational reasons. This is how I could maybe do it. This writer worked it this way. This writer did it this way. But then just, seeing it on the page helps. Like, okay, I can just, this is how I should probably be approaching the page from a basic formatting standpoint. How much commentary is in scene direction? How many parentheticals, and how do they handle transitions? And you can be looking at screenplays to see how other writers are doing it, but you're going to find, if you read, 10, 12, 15 different scripts, most writers do them differently. Some use parentheticals, some, half the time, which is a horrible idea, in my opinion. Others don't use them at all, which I'm a little bit more in that group. If you have to use a parenthetical, use it sparingly. Now, that doesn't necessarily define a script. The words on the page, of course, is the only real action we can take in order to deliver our story. That's the only, pencil we have. The only paintbrush we have is just the words. But it's what is going on inside of you from a personal level and in connection to the story you're trying to tell. That is ultimately what you're, in a way, going to be comparing yourself to. So in other words, I'll explain that. If Judd Apatow were to write Nightmare on Elm Street, he would write it the way he would want to, in his own voice, with his own opinions, with his own message, with his own style and feeling, and all of that. The emotion would be coming out from his perspective. And I think that's a huge word to consider here, because it then obviously segues us into the idea of voice. And it's something that we don't necessarily spend as much time on developing, or at least trying to understand as much as we could. And in a lot of ways, the only real weapon a writer has, in some ways, don't take that literally, but the primary weapon a writer has is their voice. And voice and perspective go hand in hand. So perspective on whatever the subject matter is, meaning, again, Judd Apatow, he's going to be telling Nightmare on Elm Street in a much different way than the original one, which, in my opinion, would actually be probably pretty fun to watch. But you're probably going to have some ridiculous comedy, some buddy comedy stuff going on, very realistic dialogue. It's going to have heart in some way. It's probably going to be true to the original material in some way. as far as the story and the characters involved, but it's going to have a much different and obviously much more comedic bent to it, because that's just who he is. So a huge part of addressing whatever project you're working on is having that level of, comparison. Like I was saying, if I were to write or present this movie, we'll say, I saw this movie the other night called Wild Mountain Thyme, which was on Amazon. It was this really cute, kind of wacky romantic comedy about these two people that live in neighboring farms in Ireland. And it's written and directed by John Patrick Shanley, who I love. He did Moonstruck and Joe versus the Volcano and a whole bunch of other things. Really talented person, but he has a very particular, just odd way about his stories. They're usually very strange in some way. Moonstruck might be his most mainstream, if you really think about it. Joe versus the Volcano was a very weird movie if you look at it. But anyway, it's a different way about it. And it's very difficult to put it into words. Like, what does it mean? What is voice? But the best way to look at it is just with that word perspective. What can I bring to this story if I were to be, writing Joe versus the Volcano? What would I be trying to say? How would I be presenting this scene? Because some people have a more dramatic and emotional response to certain situations than others. And it kind of reminds me of an interview that I did with two writers. They were writers on the cartoon Bob's Burgers. And one of them, I asked him about this just topic of voice and what he thought it meant. And he said the best way he can describe it for himself is that he grew up with a twin, and they both experienced basically the same life together. They grew up side by side, had virtually all of the same experiences. And the primary experience in their life was that their parents always fought. I mean, they were constantly fighting, not to the point of abuse, thankfully, but it was just a constant level of drama and arguing in their household. And the writer that was on the podcast was saying, I took it in a just kind of a roll off my shoulders, this is ridiculous, comedic way. He just thought it was ridiculous. And so he then looked at things throughout his life in that way. He just saw things like, oh, look at the ridiculous side of this, and look at the humor behind this kind of, sad moment. His brother, on the other hand, who had basically the same experiences, took it very differently and difficultly, meaning he didn't take it well. And it was dramatic and emotional. He didn't like it. And so that then changed his perspective on his own life throughout. He reacted in different ways, whether it's good or bad, but in a much more emotional and dramatic, melodramatic, meaningful reaction to certain situations. And that's just how they were formed. And we've all experienced that, meaning our formation, who we were from a younger age on up, and what certain moments in our lives have affected our perspective. I mean, it sounds simpler than it is to, really dig down and figure that out about who we are. But that goes into one of the exercises that I have my writers do right when we start in terms of my one-on-ones. It's a little exercise called voice pressure points, and it's the only journaling that I have the writers do, but it's to look back and try to find those moments in your life, good or bad, that affected you, that changed your perspective. I had one belief about something happened, whether it was one moment or a series of moments over a short amount of time, that suddenly made me realize this, and did that then change my perspective and how I reacted in other situations. And if you can really go back and dig into that history of yourself, you'll start to see, well, here's why I have, here's some of my flaws. You have a flaw just like your characters do. Here's how I react to certain situations. That then just naturally gets poured into the stories you're trying to write. And most of the time it's unconscious. Like, we don't necessarily realize this is why I'm creating this particular character to go into this situation. Usually, and I apologize if you hear my chair, but it squeaks and drives me crazy. But why we are creating this character and putting this person into this particular type of situation. Usually it's because, well, I just think it's cool, or I think it's kind of fun, or it's this interesting, dynamic, or whatever it is. But if you dig down a little deeper, you're going to start to see why you're the one to write this particular story. For me, and I'll just use myself as an example, for those of you who have taken my online craft course, you've probably read this already, but I'll just give a brief breakdown. Because if half of you have heard this, you're probably like, oh Lord, I'm going to do something else, look at my phone. I don't want you to do that. But so I remember I was 12 years old. At that age, baseball was my life. I was actually very, very good at it. And that's not just me bragging, like I was really pretty good. And I remember being in the back porch. It was like August, late, it was, I guess, late 80s. So maybe I wasn't quite 12. But anyway, I remember my dad and his brother, my uncle, they were sitting there, and my uncle asked me, what do you want to be when you grow up? And at the moment, I still remember this viscerally, that my response was like, well, what do you mean? Like, what a stupid question. Because in my head, the only thing I was going to be was a professional baseball player. Like, that was duh. Like I didn't react that way to my uncle, but I had that feeling of, well, I'm going to be a professional baseball player. And I actually, and specifically said, I'm going to be the shortstop for the Cubs, because I'm a huge Cubs fan. And my dad, who is probably to his own detriment, very realistic person. He comes from that generation that is naturally conservative. I don't necessarily mean that in a political way, but just, there was a different time that he grew up in. And he was trying to protect me in terms of how, his response, and he didn't raise his voice or anything, but he said, Max, you're not going to be the shortstop for the Cubs. He put it in different words, more or less, but that is how I took it. And at the time it was such a blow. Like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Like that, I had no doubt in my mind that was what was going to happen. And so ultimately what was instilled in me was this doubt, but my dream wasn't shattered. I still wanted to be the shortstop for the Cubs. But it was this sudden introduction of doubt that just came into me. And I thought, wow, wait a minute. There's like a chance that it might not happen. And I didn't cry. But I also didn't argue with him. Like, because of who I was at the time as a kid, I didn't say, well, I'm going to show you that you're wrong. Some people may have reacted that way. I kind of wish I would have had that strength. And that comes out in some of my characters. But ultimately, that shaped a lot of, my life and how I reacted to things later. This is not a sob story in any way, shape, or form. There are people who have had much more tragic situations occur that have changed their perspective. So I'm well aware that if this is the thing I'm remembering, I'm lucky. But in terms of how this has then fallen into my stories, I don't need to go into the long explanation, but I wrote a fantasy novel. I'm working on the sequel. I'm developing and taking it out to town in terms of an animated TV series. Long story short, the main character is a 16-year-old, like Tinkerbell sized fairy. And she's female. So a lot of the questions is like, why am I the one to write that character? I know nothing about, well, I should say I know nothing about women, but I don't have necessarily that connection like a woman would have writing a female character, which is just obvious. But I also, at the time of writing it, wasn't 16. I don't have a literal physical, ailment like the main character does. So I was like, okay, wow, but I didn't really question this until after I'd written the story. And what came out was that Shay, the main character, was this kind of hopeful dreamer who didn't believe in herself. And that's really the core of who she was. And it all kind of went back to this moment that I had in the past. And I looked at a whole bunch of the other projects I have and have tried to do something with. It didn't go anywhere. But all the main characters kind of had that same level of makeup, that they were either romantically hopeless but they really wanted something. There was a strong desire, but there was a lack of something. There was something internal that was keeping them from allowing themselves to achieve this thing. And it all clicked when I realized, wow, it's just my voice. And as I grew older and was looking back on this, I took it from a more, I guess you could say, comedic level, a ridiculous sort of reaction to, I don't cry myself to sleep over the fact that I never became the shortstop for the Cubs. There are other things in play than me just not believing I would become one. This is the whole other conversation. But I just, I saw the level of non-importance in terms of how I reacted as a younger man to it. Now that I'm older, like I took it very melodramatically when I was in my teens and 20s. Now that I'm, in my 40s, I'm like, come on, there are other things. And so there's just a different level of response. And so most of my projects have that reaction to it. There's that level of comedy and just over the top nature to the whole thing. So that's my level of example of a voice pressure point in comparison to this idea of, if I were the one to take on a project, am I the right person in terms of the intent of the director or the writer who gave it to me, whoever had the idea. And if you're looking to be a TV writer and you want to get staffed on a show, you have to understand that, you have to be able to write for that showrunner. It's the showrunner's show. And they're going to hire people who have obviously a lot of talent, but who are going to write in their voice. So if you're a horror writer and you love the dark and the macabre, of course you're not going to write on a Big Bang Theory. Like why? You probably wouldn't even get hired, not because you're not talented, because that's not the type of writer you are. So I think defining who you are, not just from a genre standpoint, I only write this genre, because you can write different genres. But it's your voice and your perspective and what you're trying to say from a message level, a theme level, is really what's going to define you. So that's the level of comparison that we should be making. Not, this writer writes huge block scene direction, so I can too. It's just way too open-ended, and it isn't specific enough. There are some writers like a Shane Black, Craig Zoller, who some people may not have heard of, but famous in town because he's kind of this rewrite artist, and he's really talented. And he ended up writing a movie called Bone Tomahawk. It was like this horror Western with Kurt Russell. Really, really horrific, scary, but the script is beautiful. It's so well written, but he's got these giant block scene direction, action lines. But he can do that because people trust him. And he's just so talented, and really is just this, he has a way with words. So you can get away with it if people already trust you. Like if you're a completely undiscovered writer and you're sending a script out, and a reader sees that you've got all this black on the page and there's very little space, they're going to be like, oh, well, this person may not necessarily, and they could be wrong. Like you may be as good as Craig Zoller, but they're going to see that first. And so you have to be working within this level of where am I in terms of experience, and what do people know about me as a writer. Anyway, that's a little bit of off topic. So we don't necessarily always just want to be comparing ourselves in terms of this writer did it this way on the page, so I have to do it that way too. It doesn't work that way. It goes the same way in terms of looking at structure. You don't have to follow the formula perfectly. That's a whole other lecture, but all the beats, you don't have to have this thing on page 5. This moment happened on page 11. This happened on page 50. It's not that perfect. It's not like this magic potion. You have to put the ingredients in at the right time and stir it 12 times to the left and 7 to the right. I mean, it doesn't work that way. You can write your story how you feel is necessary, but you have to understand why. And the why is then coming from this place of momentum and energy and conflict, and have I presented my character well enough in the first act so that once we put them into this second act situation, the audience is already just along for the ride. And that is a little bit of a segue into this next level of discussion, which is pretty in depth and thorough, which I probably am not going to be able to cover in another 20 to 30 minutes here, because I would like to know who has questions, and I see one in there. But this idea of plot or non-plot really is just another example of high concept, low concept. What's the difference? A few of my writers have referenced other films and said, well, this film didn't really have a plot, so why do I need one? And it's so relative to the project. Like Lady Bird is kind of an example of it's an example of a low concept idea, meaning it's purely character driven with ongoing situations that the main character experiences, all with the point of trying to show the character how to evolve, even though she doesn't necessarily realize this is what I'm trying to do. She just is trying to get out from under this shadow of her mom and family life, etc. And so it's just purely character driven. This character wants something so badly, but she doesn't know how to achieve it. In a lot of ways, that just defines low concept. High concept, you've got a really big situation. The character understands what the goal is. I don't know exactly how I'm going to achieve it, but I know I have to do this, or this horrible thing's going to happen. That's, every big movie that you've ever seen, Independence Day, National Treasure, every Star Wars movie, whatever. We've got a huge situation that's really complex as far as the plot is concerned, different steps to take and this world that we've built up, etc. Versus a Lady Bird type of low concept, which is very real life. It's almost like a snapshot of someone's life within a week or something. And we see the process of growth or non-growth. It's okay if your character doesn't completely change. Lady Bird, might show at the end that she learned something, but she basically achieved what she was trying to achieve, and that was just to go to an out-of-state college because she needed to be free. But by the time the end of the movie rolls around, she's realized that, or at least there's an inkling of the realization. It's not like I've learned my lesson, but there's this reference to, or inference, if that's the right word, they're inferring the fact that because of what she experienced in the second act, she will have probably grown by that, by the end of the movie and onward. Ultimately, what it was that she really, you could argue her flaw is that she was kind of like, I know better. I know better than the people who came before me, my dumb parents who were crazy. And so she was constantly putting herself into situations. And what happened? Those situations didn't really work out very well. And so it was a constant level of failure, which really is just your 20s. We think we know better, and we just put ourselves in situations and we're like, of course it's going to work out. And most of the time it doesn't. And so you grow and evolve, or you don't, and then you learn a harder lesson later. But Lady Bird may very well have learned a little bit of a lesson by the end there. That's a very low concept idea because the plot isn't huge. It isn't Liar Liar, where you have an obvious recurring moment in the middle of the movie. You don't have a National Treasure where there's a map on the back of the Declaration of Independence. We have to steal that in order to find the treasure. It's really simple. So when you instead have a low concept project, which you can, like you should as often as you can, just like you should also have a high concept project. But if you do have a low concept project, then you really have to do the character development work, because the character is the one that then drives the whole story, layers upon layers. And who are the other secondaries, and what are the situations that this character is in, and why? The why is so essential. And the why is just this level of meaning. What am I trying to say with this story? Because somebody else could write the same script and say something different. They have a different reason for telling this story. And so you have to be digging in, like I was saying in the beginning here, with this idea of, okay, I've got this idea. How does it connect to me? But sometimes I shouldn't say sometimes, most of the time, that's how an idea pops up. You wake up in the morning and you're like, gosh, that was a weird dream. Could it be a movie? As opposed to, what does it mean? Because that's ultimately what dreams are saying. We're looking inside of our unconscious, and it's usually, in reference to some kind of anxiety or fear. I mean, let's face it, that's what most dreams are. And so if you can understand what your own fears are, you can put those into your characters and then build that character up and go, what would be the best situation to put this character in so that things are really difficult and so that the character can overcome it? How they overcome it, obviously, is the execution of the second act. That's the plot stuff, but which is fine. I'm not trying to wave away plot. There's a plot in every single story. I don't care what story you're reading. Everything has a plot. Some are just bigger than others. But anyway, you're trying to figure out what's the best situation to put this kind of character in. And really, you can be looking at that from a high concept standpoint too. I have a script that never went anywhere, which is kind of a downer because people enjoyed it, but I think it was just a little too unmarketable, if that's the right word. But who knows, maybe it'll come back. But it was this comedy adventure. And so I've just been using it as really more like an educational tool for my writers and in the coursework. But it's a comedy adventure. And I knew that, you know, I'm a little bit of a history nerd, and I love the stories of King Arthur and the Knights Templar. And I really wanted to write something about them. And I started developing like this really melodramatic action adventure. And then the Da Vinci Code came out, and I was like, wow, he did it a lot better than I did. So I changed everything and I turned it into a comedy. But I came from a place of, I want this to be character driven, because the concept or the plot, we've kind of seen it, Indiana Jones and Da Vinci Code and all, you know. So what can I do to change it up? And I went to character in order to do that. And I basically just exaggerated myself. Like, what if I was in the situation where I was kind of searching for the holy grail or whatever? And I immediately thought it would be awful because I'm not like a world traveler. And I mean, I shouldn't say awful. It would be amazing to go see some of these places, and I want to. But I, you know, I just don't love traveling. Once I get to a place, it's great. It's just the travel part that sucks. And so I started looking at myself and thinking, what can I do to really exaggerate myself and all of my flaws? And so I created a character based on that. And then I thought, well, what would be the worst situation to put this character in? And I eventually came up with an extreme sports tour through Europe, where it's not just a basic, you know, mom and pop kind of let's go see museums tour, but they're literally parachuting on a planes, you know, white water river rafting, they're jousting, you know, the crazy things that this character would never want to do. But what's egging him on is this amazing historical trip that he's going on, because he's this like uber history nerd. He knows everything about Knights Templar, which I don't. And so that was continuing, you know, his process. But then I added the fact that the tour guide really believed that they were going to find Excalibur at the end of it. And she believed that Arthur, the main character, would help her do it because he was the smartest one in the group, blah, blah, blah. So what I came up with first in terms of the general story was the second act. And I think that's so important to comment on. And I have to stress to everybody, we have to get beyond this level of brainstorming where we're just coming up with the setup. We have to get to a place where, what does the second act look like? Even if it's not perfect, even if I don't know exactly what's going to happen, I have to come from a place of the unique action the character is taking in order to achieve something, whether it's a big goal like find Excalibur, or if it's just a small goal like I need to leave home because I can't stand my parents, like in Lady Bird. Whatever that is, you have to then look at the second act first. The setup to it is just primarily character stuff. What does the character want? Why can't the character have it? Who's the one presenting this new opportunity to this character, whether the character knows it's an opportunity or not. You know, it's the setup event or the inciting incident, whatever you want to call it. It's just getting the framework down in that first act, which is extremely important. I'm, again, not trying to wave that off. But the second act in a movie is what audiences are going to be experiencing for the, you know, the brunt of their movie going experience. Where TV is concerned, it's even more important because you're hoping to get 3, 4, 5 seasons, right? So this situation needs to be ongoing and not just one plot situation, but multiple character storylines, and they have to continually be interesting, not from only an emotional standpoint from the characters, which is really important, but from a recurring reference. Like, that's why the procedural shows are so popular, you know, the Law and Orders and the CSIs, because you have so many different situations. It's almost like a sitcom for the hour-long drama, you know, because you just have a new case every day or every week. So we, you know, if you don't have a procedural approach to your TV show, totally fine. Most of the shows are non-procedural, but you still need somewhat of this recurring effect that every time an audience member is going to tune in, it's going to be a continuation of what we had previously experienced. And as far as a situation, you know, I'm trying to think of, like, Breaking Bad is a perfect example. We know that we're going to see some level of a science teacher, ex-science teacher who has cancer, trying to help his family financially, by starting a drug business. That is what we're going to be seeing on a very basic level every episode. But the lack of a better word, interesting part of tuning in is seeing how it evolves. And ultimately, the whole thing is in the title. We're seeing how this character is literally breaking bad. And it just gets worse and worse and worse, but we're loving it because he's loving it. Anyway, I don't want to break down Breaking Bad, but so going back to this idea of making sure you understand what your second act is for TV, yes, you have to develop the pilot, but the pilot has to be presenting what the future situations are going to be in some way, or at least reference to what they're going to be experiencing in future episodes, because you don't need to write every single episode of your series. And please don't, actually. It may be a detriment, not only to your time, but the whole point of a show is to hopefully find a showrunner to make it. You are not very likely not going to be the showrunner on your show. Because you haven't, I'm assuming, we have a decent amount of people in here. I doubt we have any experienced showrunners watching. But so you have to just present the template for the whole series. And so the pilot's needed, of course, but then you also need a pitch Bible. You don't need a full Bible. And the difference, like a real show Bible, a true show Bible is like 40 some plus pages, maybe even longer. And it's something that the actual series people, the writers and the showrunner and the executive producers, they create that so that they are giving that, show Bible to their team, because they're planning out everything. For you developing a TV series, you have to be able to see all the elements, but we don't need to go into every single detail. You're going to be presenting the log lines of the series, the first season, the pilot log line, and then the series log line, which is just an overall reference. You're going to have a one-page summary. You're going to have character breakdowns and bios, maybe a paragraph, nothing too crazy and long, of each character. And then you're going to have episode descriptions, which again will maybe be a paragraph long for the first maybe 10 episodes, and then you can give little summaries if you wanted for future seasons. Here's how the show evolves. But it's just to allow the reader to get an understanding of how this show can repeat. And we could get 100 episodes, or we could see multiple seasons. Because once a showrunner comes on and you are lucky enough to get into that place where my show is getting made, which, if that ever happens to you, please let us know, because it's a huge deal. They're going to run with it the way they want. The showrunner is going to take it over. You, of course, will probably be on board in some fashion as an executive producer or staff writer or whatever, consulting producer, but they're going to make it their own show. And which is fine. You have to be able to let that go a little bit. Anyway, I'm going off on a long tangent about TV Bibles, but that's technically what happens sometimes. Only one question in the Q&A box. If you guys have more questions, feel free to throw them out. But the long story short here is that we have to be breaking all of what we do as artists down to the level of, why am I doing this? Like what are we doing? This is really hard. And sometimes even harder to sell something and make a living doing it. And that's just the hard truth. It's not me being pessimistic in any way, shape, or form. This can be a really rewarding process, but that's what we need to dig into. Like, what am I trying to do? Yes, I have fun writing and telling stories, but stories have a reason for existing. There's a reason for us to tell them, beyond just basic entertainment. Sometimes you've got just popcorn movies, and it's fine. There's no reason to shy away from those. But even those have messages to give. Even those huge, big budget type of movies have pieces of you in it. And you're going to spend a long time developing that project, sometimes years, just to get it hopefully made. So you really have to ask yourself, okay, what's important to me from a personal level? How do I get this into the story? Because other people will see that. There's a universality to every emotion and every feeling. Everybody has felt in one way or another what you have felt. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do as artists, is just connect with other people. Here's my version of this feeling. Really is what every artist does, whether they're a painter, an author, a screenwriter, a musician. Here's my version of the feeling, and other people will be able to see that. And so there's a need to dig in and dive into this idea of what's my voice, what am I trying to say, looking at the projects that I'm currently developing and writing. Why am I the one to write this story from a meaningful level? Meaning, what am I trying to say and present? And then try to execute that through a character within a situation. I mean, obviously, that is a huge summary, and I'm putting it in a much easier said than done kind of way. But that's really all plot is just a situation. And obviously, then you have multiple situations within the overall situation. But I like using that word instead of plot, because plot, it doesn't come with this kind of inferred definition, like, well, what does that word mean? But situation has a much more specific feeling to it. You know that there's going to be some level of conflict, there's going to be some kind of an obstacle, at least one character involved, probably more than one, in any situation. Like, the idea of that term, we have a situation, usually means there's a problem. So we need that approach of just breaking down what's our second act, what am I trying to say with this type of character experiencing this situation, and then allow for those moments that the character is experiencing to then present flaw. I know that sounds like a big jump, but the character is ultimately going through this situation in order to overcome something personally. And that personal issue, that wound that Jen Grisanti is a consultant, that she uses that word a lot. There's a wound deep down that they don't necessarily know or understand that they have. And that just becomes confronted over and over again through the situation you're putting them in. Now, how does this all come back and tie into the idea of the title of the video, originality? If you can instill yourself into the plot or the situation, and then, because I'll back up a second, basically every story's been told. There's no brand new story. Every general paradigm has been presented to people. But the reason we continually see new versions is because of the writer who decided to use this paradigm and put their commentary into it, their perspective into it. So that's how you allow a project to be original. Obviously, if you write, like I saw the Da Vinci Code, and I knew I was writing pretty much the same story, but just not as good, I'm not going to do that. And that's like too direct and obvious. It's not original, and it's going to be almost impossible to sell a project when they're like, well, that movie just came out. That's a different story. How to be original is a much more personal question. First question from Mateo: how do you deal with inner critic and procrastination or writer's block? It's a really good question. It's a big one. The easiest answer is to step away and not think about it. If you're having trouble and you can tell that you're pushing the pages, that you're just like not feeling it, and you're like, ugh, or you just can't come up with this level of an idea or a brainstorm, or you just don't feel like writing, just let it go and trust that it's going to come back. But that can, and in the worst way, lead to never writing again. And we don't want that to happen. So the best thing to admit, and this is what changed me, was understanding that writer's block isn't actually a real thing. It's not something that comes from the outside of you and attacks you. It's you. There's something else going on inside of you that is stopping you from doing this thing. So owning it is the first level there. Okay, it exists. It's me. It's not an outside force. Let's just get up and do something else. But in order to correct it, and this is not going to be an easy answer, you have to be disciplined. You can't feel guilty if you aren't disciplining yourself, though, because that then gets into this terrible, spiral. And you're feeling guilty, and then you're like, I'm not disciplined, and then you're not getting it done, and then you feel guilty, and like, oh, I'm not disciplined. It's this circle. So you just have to accept that this is important. It isn't the most important thing, but there is a level of again, going back to that question, why am I doing this? What is fun about the process, and trying to remind yourself of that fun at least gets you inspired. Believe me, I've been there. Procrastination hits every single writer. The inner critic part, I mean, there's nothing wrong with being critical of, some of your work, but you really have to back up and be like, hold on a second, I'm who I am right now. My talent is where it is right now. It's going to improve. Let's just put it out. It's not going to be perfect the first time, much less maybe even by the end. You're going to be sitting in the movie theater watching a movie that you wrote and it got made, and you're still going to be going, oh boy, that scene was not, I didn't like that, or that line was terrible. You're always going to be critical of yourself. You just have to have that healthy level of criticism. Otherwise, it really becomes debilitating. And then, there are other things in your life that are more important that you can't allow to be affected by that. So I don't know. Hopefully that helped, Mateo. I mean, it's a tough one because it's so relative to the person. Some people who are procrastinators have, very real reasons to procrastinate. They have health issues, or they have 3 kids, or, they work a full-time job 7 days a week. I get it. Sometimes you're just fucking tired, and, pardon my French, but it's true. And it's okay to be like, oh God, I just don't have the energy for it. Most often than not, though, I've found that if you just sit down and try to write something, even if it's journaling, like Patrick's saying, don't be a perfectionist. Just get into some kind of creative flow. If you're in any way athletic, or even if you just like taking walks, it helps to get the heart rate going. You've probably heard all of these answers, but they all help. Could you give examples of one sentence high concept with the hook? Oh boy. Put me on the spot here. So an example of a high concept hook is liar, liar. A lawyer unable to tell a lie for 24 hours. That's the basic hook. I mean, I could go into a very long lecture about liar, liar, but it's the movie with Jim Carrey. The reason it's a hook, and the reason that word exists in that way, is because that situation continually hooks us back around. We're continually experiencing it. It's evolving and changing, but it's only evolving and changing because of the character needs and desires. Jim Carrey's trying to land partner at his law firm. To make it worse, which we all need to be considering that term, to make it worse, we have to be piling things on for an emotional level and a basic plot level, make things difficult for the character. But to make it worse, his own son is the reason he's kind of cursed for 24 hours, because his own son wished that his dad would stop lying. That then brings in the emotional element of, Jim Carrey realizing that he's a bad dad. So the hook itself is usually just completely plot oriented, The Purge. Every year you get one night where it's anarchy, people can do anything, they can kill everybody, blah, blah, blah. So there's a historical nature to the idea. This isn't necessarily the first year that this has happened, but we can see it, right? When we say that, meaning we can see it, we literally can see that. Anybody can be like, oh, wow. So it's at night, people are going to be kind of freaking out, and there will be other people out there trying to kill other people. What does that look like? That's crazy. And then you start adding the elements of character, etc. Low concept is purely character driven. We have, a character who has a really difficult relationship with her mom, and all she wants is just to move and to get out of town and go to college out of state. But in the meantime, she's trying to experience as much of life as possible because she feels she deserves that. And so once we get to a statement where we can start seeing what it might look like, now you're getting somewhere. It's like, okay, I think I know what my second act is going to be. I have this story that I've been trying to work on forever, and it's because I can't decide on what the second act is. I have really fun setup, but I can't make a decision on what that second act is going to look like. And that second act has a lot to do with, what type of movie is this? Is it going to be really big? Is it going to be really contained? Hopefully that helps. Patrick Malone, speaking of baseball, I have a concept that involves a major league player involved in a scandal that keeps him out of the Hall of Fame. Do I need permission from the team to use that team? Now, I'm not a lawyer, so please don't take my advice as, the say all and end all. The best question, the best route is to literally find somebody who could actually tell you that answer from a legal standpoint. If you're just writing the script with the intention of eventually getting permission, write the script how you want the movie to happen. And then, just if you can get in the hands of a producer, you can tell them, I'm fully aware that there are probably copyright issues in terms of the names and the organizations that I'm using. We're going to have, that hurdle to get over, but I just wanted to get the story down because this is important. But it could be a big enough hurdle to stop the project from going forward. So it's a good question, Patrick, but you should definitely try to figure out, what are the reasons I want to tell the story. Can I tell it without the team name? Can I change it up so I don't have to worry about anything, legal? Or you just try to find an entertainment attorney or somebody who has that side of, copyright law that might be able to help. I'm not a lawyer, so I really can't give you that, pure legal advice, but I do know that you have some options. Let's see. Next question. I'd like to write a pilot for a kids' TV show. How can I approach it? I mean, what things should I take into consideration? This is probably going to be good news for a lot of people on multiple fronts. So TV animation right now is huge. Everybody's looking for it, whether it's adult animation, ages 6 to 11, ages 4 to 6, or preschool. It's huge. And there's actually an age range from 14 to 17 now. 14 to 17, it's very difficult. I've been working with my agent a lot in terms of developing a kids animated show based on my book series, and we're going out with that. And so it's a good question to ask me because I'm just kind of in it right now. But so that's one side that's really positive. The market is looking for this. The second positive is that you don't need to write the pilot. I know that sounds like jaw-dropping. You don't actually have to write the pilot. I did anyway because I wanted to have that available. Talking about Mateo's question in Inner Critic, I don't think it's all that great, but I'm not going to tell the industry that. But the idea is good. And if you have a really unique story that is different, something that has not really been seen, which is even more important in kids animation. Now, you're saying kids TV show, if it's live action, you are going to need a pilot. I'm not sure if it's live action or not, but if it's animation, you don't need it. You just need a really solid, incredibly well done and professional pitch Bible, which is going to be much longer than an hour long. You're going to get all the elements in there. You really have to hit tone in terms of what it's going to look like, what the animation might look like. We need a really detailed pitch Bible. For a kids TV show, you treat it like a live action show. So you have to have the pilot done. You want to have some form of a pitch Bible so that we can see how, what some of the future episodes are going to be. So depending on what you're trying to do, live action or animation, you have options. Jackie, when do you bring co-writers into a project? I'm writing a series that has a larger cast with diverse perspectives, so I'll need a writing team, but I don't want to get ahead of myself either. So, without knowing the project, Jackie, it's hard for me to answer the question specifically. My initial response is, why do you need a writing team? And I get it that if you are of one cultural background and you don't have the experience of another cultural background, then you get advisors. You don't necessarily need someone to co-write it with you. If you need someone who lives in a different section of the country, they have a much different dialect or something, belief systems, and you need to get into that, you have to have an understanding of that. Totally makes sense, and it would help to talk to some of those people first. You don't necessarily need them as co-writers. If they are already writers, great, but it kind of depends on the project. So as far as when to bring them in, as early as possible, getting their perspective on the beliefs, et cetera. But then there's a different process of how do you actually write the dialogue, and that could be something that they check later. You just write what it is that needs to be said in the right place, and then you can ask them, how can we make this feel more authentic? If you're a 70-year-old male, how do you write a 12-year-old female? That's in and of itself a whole other language. So it definitely helps early on to get that perspective. Let's see here. What advice do you have on trying to define your voice after you've already been put in a category? My personal experience is that people assume I write only stories because of my mixed race background, when that's not all I write. Do you just keep writing authentically until something sticks? So I think you answered your question at the end. You just have to be authentic. And I know it's kind of a lazy answer. But yeah, just be authentic to who you are. In terms of pigeonholing, it's real and it exists. If you write Get Out and it's as popular and huge as it was, the industry is going to expect you to continue working within that medium. You don't have to, especially if it's something as huge as Get Out. You're going to be able to write whatever you want. So maybe that's not a great example. But if you have success in one genre, yeah, I mean, other people are going to be coming to you with these writing assignments in that genre, or because you've proven yourself there, and that's totally fine. And you are able to try to weave yourself into those projects, from a personal level, but you don't have to accept it. Some writers, here's my best way of saying it. Get yourself established as much as you can first. Slowly try to not eke out, but present to the world or your representation. I have these other projects that I would like to do. They're not in the same vein. And maybe it just doesn't happen for a little bit, but if you're still finding some level of success, ride that success. Don't be too drastic in terms of, I wrote this amazing horror movie, I need to write this romantic comedy now. Take your time, let things just kind of simmer a little bit. There are a lot of writers out there who have bounced around from genre to genre. But I'm just looking at your question again to make sure that I'm hitting it all. Do you just keep writing authentically until something sticks? I mean, I think that really yes is the answer to that. Sherry, are you saying the core of authentic writing is vulnerability? I think that's a big part of it. And being vulnerable with yourself and knowing your own personal issues and emotional problems and flaws. None of us are perfect. We all have issues, some smaller than others, and we're lucky in that way. But I think owning that vulnerability is only then going to allow it to transfer to the characters and the journey that they're going on. So yeah, I think that's a huge part of the writing process, vulnerability. Mark, what should you think? What should you think if you examine what you're writing and you can't find your own personal connection to what you're writing, but you want to continue it anyway, and it isn't stopping you? Really good question, Mark. I think finding a way to connect yourself to the material personally is necessary. And maybe it's just through one particular character that isn't the main character, or, you've never experienced the situation the character is going through, but you can kind of, like my little example of my comedy adventure, I'm never going to go on an extreme sports tour, and I never have, but I can imagine what that might be and how I would react in it. So you can't find your own personal connection. I think, imagine, I mean, if you can't at all, then you really have to examine what is it about the story. My argument is, Mark, that there probably is some level of a connection to it, even if it's just, I think it's a ton of fun, the idea. Then, look at that answer. Well, why do I think it's so much fun? Like, what's going on about the fun with me? Like, would I like to experience it, or do I wish I could? Try to dig in a little bit. I mean, if you want to write it, then write it, but sometimes, there are projects that it's okay to walk away from because it's just not working. If you feel it's really working, great. But again, I think you should try to figure out what it is that gets me excited about the idea, and then live that, and then make it as if you're connected to it. Research that, process, and then find a way to get in there. It's Toby. Since no idea is ever actually original and your own personal voice is so important in telling a story, how protective should you be of your ideas when talking them through with other people? There seem to be a lot of new writers who get very nervous about sharing their concepts, and I don't have a sense of whether they're being rational or whether it's better, as I usually have, to share the idea widely to test drive whether it seems to be working or not. So it's a good question. And, there's nothing wrong with being a little concerned about sharing your ideas, because the truth is, it has happened in the past where people have stolen ideas. And the harder truth is that there is very little you can do about it. So I just kind of get the negative answer out of the way. The positive and the happier answer is that it rarely happens. It really does not happen very often. It does, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't happen very often. Sometimes if you come up with a really hooky idea, The Purge, Liar, Liar, something really big like that, that would be a good idea to be like, I've got this big hook. I don't think it's ever been done before, or at least in this way. I am going to kind of keep that close to my chest, because big hooks are what people can easily run with. There's no legal protection over that. So sometimes it's not a terrible idea to be like, I think I have this really, excellent hook here. But if you have a specific approach, to a character-driven story, et cetera, you are going to write it differently than someone else. And so it's okay, especially in this type of forum. I would hope and expect that if you were to share something here, that everybody else would be like, you know what, honor code, it's their project. Lindy says, last question, do you think pitching at conferences is worth the effort and money when they are usually looking for summer action scripts? Okay, so specific portion of the answer or question there at the end. For one thing, the hard truth about pitch conferences is that it's kind of like playing the lottery if you intend to sell something there or through the connections you make there. Rarely happens. I think ideas are stolen more often than pitches being purchased at pitch conferences. Now, it's not to say that the people you meet and sit down with and have conversations with and pitch ideas to can't turn into long-term relationships. That's the healthiest way of going about it. I want to sit in front of a manager, I want to sit in front of a producer of some kind, and I just want to make friends with this person, or at least have a business connection, because who knows what might happen in the future. If I stay in connection, if I have future success stories, I'll let them know, just to keep them, updated. The other half of the answer, and why I think pitch conferences are actually very worthwhile, is because it's extremely educational. It's rare for you to get firsthand experience of practicing pitching. So, if you go to a pitch conference, even if it's one day, and you can sit down and pitch, 2 or 3 year projects 20, 25 times to people, that is hugely important. And the experience of that is only going to help you, because you're going to feel it after a while, like, oh God, I bombed that one, or I nailed that one. Why? What can I do to continue doing that? Or, it's a great way to really break down your storytelling process. It's a great way to get over the nerves of talking about yourself, of, being the person who is instigating the conversation and not just listening. It's hard pitching ideas. So for that reason alone, I think it's very worthwhile. And if you go to pitch conferences expecting to sell something, and that, you're probably not going to feel like you got as much out of it. Go to network, meet new friends, fellow writers, producers, managers, and practice the process of pitching. If you end up actually making a great connection with somebody, a producer or a manager loves the project, great. That's just, use that as a bonus, but don't be disappointed if you come away from the pitch conference weekend and you're like, oh, I didn't sell anything. It's not an expo. You don't have plumbing tools that you're trying to find a distributor for. Like, it's a completely different business. I do have one more question, a new question. I specifically want to write only to older female leads. It's my brand, if you will. I'm told that that's not a good thing. What do you think? Well, I don't know who would tell you it's not a good thing. I think there's a huge audience in an older female audience, and it gives opportunities to older female actors, which sadly there are not enough of those opportunities. So keep going with that. Everybody, you all need to be writing what you feel is important to you, because that's ultimately what's going to get you noticed. Talent and craft, and actually, being good with words. How ironic, I can't say that right correctly. But that just comes through practice. Like, that is a learnable process, figuring out formatting, how do I arrange the words on the page, all that stuff. That's learnable, and it's something you're always going to get better at as you go. Meryl Streep still has an acting coach. You're constantly trying to improve the level of the craft. In terms of who you are as a writer from a meaningful side, perspective and theme and message, own that and then write to it. And your scripts will eventually, get to a place where the rest of the universe, rest of the industry starts accepting them. And if you're writing from a place of meaning, then it, in a way, in a small way, maybe, I think in a big way, but it's worthwhile, even if you don't sell anything. Then you're still having fun. You're still telling stories that are meaningful. You're allowing that process of detachment, and you're not just so concerned with the outcome, and you're just enjoying the process. That's really where we all need to be. Obviously, we want other people to experience our stories, and you want to sell some stuff. You'd love to make a career. Our goal should be that what I have to say deserves to be heard, and I would like other people to hear it. And so, that's all we really can do at the end of the day. That's it, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the week. Things are warming up. Spring is around the corner, and the summer is just right behind. So we have hope. We'll see everybody soon. Until next time, just keep writing, keep working hard, and I'll talk to you soon.